Hey there, welcome to Up Until Now with Kristen Hallinan, where we are healing from yesterday's hurts, allowing God to redeem our story, and finding hope for our family's future. Up until now, you may have been suffering from old wounds, trying to live in your own strength, or playing it too small. But around here, we know that who you were, or even the person you are today, is not a permanent seal on who you are becoming. In Jesus, the best is always yet to come. Welcome back to another episode of Up Until Now. I am thrilled to introduce our guest to you today. We on this show are in the business of talking about naming the pains of yesterday for the purpose of healing today and then finding hope for tomorrow. And that is exactly the conversation that our guest brings to the table. Paige Allen is an executive pastor at Church on the Rock in Lubbock, Texas, a vibrant and diverse multi-site congregation. She pastors a staff there and gives oversight to global missions, the New Legacy Home for Women, and Bloom Women's Ministry. Paige co-hosts the podcast Bloom Talks and travels internationally to speak and teach. She and her husband, Josh, have 2 daughters and live in Lubbock, Texas. Paige, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm so excited to be here.
Will you tell us a little bit more about who is Paige? How did you come to be a pastor and get to oversee all these really cool organizations?
Sure. I'd love to tell you. Okay. So I'm actually a pastor's kid. I grew up in the church, and as much as I loved God, though, it was always my plan to stay far away from working for the church. But I love how God is, he just has a way of bringing things around. And when I was a teen, I really did feel like God said that I was called to ministry. I still was trying to define that in a way outside of the local church. But then later on, when I was in my 20s, I kind of walked away, not from the Lord, but definitely from my home church. I'd moved towns and was just really dealing even with some of the church hurt that comes from being a pastor's kid. And one Sunday, I visited my parents, and I just had this God moment where literally I just started crying. And I felt like the Lord said, I want you to look around, and I want you to realize your heart is healed. And I realized so much of the baggage that I had carried from just growing up and feeling like I was in the fishbowl, that the Lord had really healed that. And then as I was kind of in that place, I felt like the Lord said, these are your people too. And I just said, okay, Lord. And then I actually said, if that's really you, you have to tell my husband, because he doesn't want to move back. So long story short, the Lord spoke to my husband. We moved back. I actually wasn't on the church staff for a couple of years, but a couple of years after moving back, I joined the church staff. I have worked, and so this is my dad's church that I work at.
Okay.
I've been here now for over 20 years. My dad has since handed it off. He's no longer the lead pastor. He's just the founding pastor. So I have seen this beautiful group of believers grow. I have seen us stretch. I've seen us walk through hard things. And I've kind of gotten to wear a lot of different hats. That's why I do so many things now, as I've been here for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, that is incredible. We talk a lot about legacy on this show, and talk about legacy. That is such a beautiful story. And it wasn't like this was beautiful and perfect, and then I just always knew I wanted it, and here I am. But you had to wrestle with that and let God speak to you, and
Yes.
the legacy that He has handed down through your family. That's really beautiful. I love it.
I often have young women specifically ask me how do you know if you're called to the ministry? How do you know if you're supposed to be in a church? And I will say, you've got to hear that from the Lord, because it's the kind of job that, yes, there are a lot of beautiful, fun things, but there's a lot of hard things. And it's that knowing, that I didn't just sign up for this, but he really told me that I'm supposed to do this, that keeps you in it on the days that are hard.
Yeah. That's good. So you have had the chance to talk with a ton of women through all the ministries that you oversee. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned through their stories, because I know there's been a lot of hard stories that you've dug into also.
I have. It's such a privilege to get to walk with women, and when they feel safe to share their stories. And, over the years, I've walked through women facing loss, just asking God hard questions. I've found different threads, though, I would say, that kind of carry through most women. I feel like regardless of your socioeconomic background, regardless of your culture, regardless of whether you're on a mountaintop or a valley, I've found women are constantly asking a few questions. And one of them is, am I really valuable? Does anybody actually see me? Is what I'm doing, does it have any worth? Does anyone notice it? I started noticing those themes running through a lot of our conversations. So that's a big one that I've seen.
Yeah. And so you're seeing that across socioeconomic lines and different backgrounds. That's just like a women theme. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think I've talked to a lot of single young women, in their 20s, and their big question is, when am I going to find someone? When is God going to bring me? But what ends up happening is there's this underlying question of, does anyone see me? Like, am I valuable? And then it kind of will move on to another phase of maybe moms with young kids. And so often when they're in my office talking and they're so frustrated, it's like, what is the point of my days? I'm just like
Yeah.
picking up goldfish crumbs and driving
Yes.
carpool. And like my husband comes home and he doesn't even know what I've done.
Uh-huh.
And I honestly, I haven't had a lot of these conversations, but for some reason in the last probably 2 years, I've encountered a lot of women that are either widows or empty nesters. And they're kind of having those same feelings of like the things that I have devoted a lot of my time and energy to, those seasons have shifted. And I almost just feel untethered. Like, who am I? What am I doing? What's my purpose?
Mhm.
And those are three such distinct different phases of life,
Mhm.
but the core of those questions are the same. I mean, they're questions of this innate need, I think, that we have to know that we're seen
Mhm.
and loved for the essence of who we are, not for what we do, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Yeah. With so many, we all share those needs. And I know from my own experience and other people I've talked to that going through a lot of hard things, a lot of pain can contribute to feeling voiceless.
Mm-hmm.
And it just piles on to that desire to feel seen and heard. Why do you think that we struggle so much when we want this so badly? Why do you think it's so hard for us to find it?
I think one reason it's so hard to find it is our world defines what it should look like.
Mm,
And yet, a lot of times that's out of our reach. I think the world oftentimes defines like, okay, well, you're going to feel more secure when you have XYZ. That may be certain relationships. That may be a quote unquote platform. That may be, that you're invited to whatever, group you've decided means that you've arrived. And so I think sometimes there's this struggle of, even though when maybe someone from the outside is looking at your life and is like, actually, you are so valuable. There are so many things that you're bringing to the table. It's like you can't see it for yourself so long as you're defining those things by what our world says, this is what it looks like when you've arrived and when you're bringing value to a situation.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can really relate to that because when we're looking all around us or even looking in ourselves to like validate who we are, I feel like we come up empty-handed so often, or we come up short compared to what we're seeing around us. And it's not until we start looking up until we get that sense of identity straight.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I also have some friends that are quote unquote influencers, and it doesn't matter if you have what you think you want, all this fame or numbers or whatever, they're dealing with those same questions. So the only thing that's really going to meet some of those needs and those questions is that true connection with the Lord, where He is speaking directly to your heart, like, hey, I see you. Like, I see you in the midst of the goldfish crumbs. I see you empty-handed, and I still choose you.
Yes. Yeah. That idea that he sees us in all of our ugliness and he still chooses us, I think is wild.
Yeah, it so is, right? Like, I'm like, a lot of times I'm like, surely there's someone else that you want to choose because
Uh-huh.
I'm a hot mess right now.
Totally. It's like I look at me and I don't want to choose me a lot of the days, but the
Mm-mm.
creator of the whole universe that can just have whatever he wants, he still loves me even after seeing me.
Yes.
It's
Yeah,
crazy. Yeah.
it really is.
I love the premise of your new book because it's all around this topic. It's called He Knows Your Name. And you examine stories of nameless women from the Bible. And I have not seen someone do that before. And so I was so excited to dig in. Tell us what propelled you to study those nameless women.
Well, several years ago, like almost a decade ago, I was teaching a Bible study. And afterwards, a lady in our church, her name is Michelle, she came up to me and she was talking about how she was studying, I think it was the widow of Zarephath, a woman in the Old Testament. And she was telling me about the things the Lord was teaching her. And she just said in passing, she said, there's just something about the nameless women of the Bible that I just love. And I walked away from that conversation and literally, like, it would not leave me that phrase, nameless women. And I thought, I have never thought of them by that label or that phrase. And I just started realizing how many of those women's stories I was drawn to. Like, I was teaching about the woman with the issue of blood or the woman at the well. And so I just kind of decided, I made this one year, I was like, I'm just going to dive deep and study the nameless women of the Bible. And it was so much fun. And as I began to study them, I almost felt like, they are a little bit of a reflection of women today. And there's almost something, I don't think I even say this in the book, the fact that we don't know their names, I don't know if it makes it easier to put ourselves in their shoes, but like they could be us. They could be our next door neighbor. They could be our sister, And yeah, so that's what I was drawn to.
That's really cool. I was really drawn to your chapter about what you call the woman caught in the middle, because I have always thought her story. So it's about the woman that the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, are dragging into the temple to point out her adultery and to purpose of shaming her. And Jesus's response is just like the opposite of what everybody would expect. And so I love that you dug into her. You said, for the woman caught in the middle, it was Jesus bending down to her level and writing in then dust that mixed with her tears. He stayed close to her. And when all the accusers stepped away, he stepped closer and called to her righteousness and purity as he named her free and admonished her to sin no more. He was her advocate, and he wants to be ours, but there is often a hesitation on our part. When he draws near, ready to peel back layers of pain, do we welcome his presence or do we hide, stiff arm, and ignore his voice? I felt like you saw my soul with that question because I have been so guilty of stiff arming God as if he doesn't already know everything anyways. But why do you think that we have a tendency to do that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'm the same way. And I write later actually a little story that the Lord used to speak to me. I think as women, we create defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from further hurt. And although our brains know that there is safety with the Lord, our hearts that have been hurt, that have been wounded, that have had really hard things, they sometimes still struggle to actually believe and come into sync with what our brains know, that no, he is really safe. I tell this really brief story about how I have at the time a 4-year-old soon to be niece. She was the daughter of my now brother-in-law. My daughter was engaged to him, and he had full custody of this beautiful little 4-year-old girl. We didn't have any kids in our family yet. And one night we had a family dinner, and afterwards my family, they were all cleaning up the dining room table, and I go back in the dining room and my dad bends down to this little 4-year-old girl and he looks her in the eye and he says, Taylor, I just want you to know I love you and I'm so glad you're going to be a part of our family. And without missing a beat, she goes, ruff, 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 ruff. I'm a little dog, which was not what I was expecting. It was like this really sweet moment. My dad's not even like a super affectionate guy. And so he just like pats her on the head. And he's like, okay, yeah, get a little doggy. And she runs off. And I go to get the silverware. And I feel like the Holy Spirit just whispered to my heart, you do that to me all the time. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? What? And I was like, bark at you? Like, what are you talking about?
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, it was like the Lord just like unveiled it to me. And I understood what he meant, because what I knew was this little 4-year-old girl. She had faced a lot of rejection already. That's why her dad had
Yeah.
full custody of her. Her mom had chosen some other things in her life. And so even though she was only 4 years old, she had already created defense mechanisms when someone got close to her heart with love. And the truth was, she was still trying to figure our family out. Like,
Mhm.
can I trust these people? Can I let
Yeah.
them in? Or are they just going to disappoint me as well? And so when my dad, he's a great dad, he's an amazing grandpa, came close and wanted to just speak love, what rose up was what? A 4-year-old's defense mechanisms, which is, I need to get away. So ruff, ruff, ruff. I'm a little dog.
Yeah.
And I think we do that, Kristen, with the Lord so often. Our defense mechanisms are much more sophisticated. Mine is usually like, I'm fine, God. Everything's fine. Like, there's nothing to deal with right now.
Yeah.
Like, I've already
Mhm.
dealt with that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Or this belief that if we look really pretty and put together, God's gonna love us more. And so,
Hmm.
like, I'm gonna stiff arm you just until like I feel a little bit better about how I look, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah.
Eh, yeah.
Yeah, we don't think about it this way, but like I've met women who, I mean, they're the ultimate servers at the church. They are the ultimate volunteers. And although the Lord loves their service and their volunteer, sometimes they are just staying so busy doing the right thing so that they don't have any margin or time for the Lord to actually come close and do real healing in their hearts. Thankfully, God loves us enough. He's going to keep coming,
Yeah.
until we will, say, okay, here you go.
I had a friend ask me one time when I was asking for prayer about something, and she asked me, "Have you prayed about it?" And I was like, "Ooh," because I was not praying for my own things. I was really great at praying for everyone else's,
Yeah.
but I had the betrayal and abandonment in my own story, had the narrative going in my mind that I couldn't come to God with the most vulnerable needs and hurts that I had, because I needed to believe that He was good. And if He didn't show up for me, if He turned around and abandoned me, I couldn't take that. And so I
Mm,
wasn't going to give Him the chance to. And I just felt so convicted in that moment. Like, that's an accusation against God's character. I'm not really believing his goodness. I'm
mhm.
not really believing that he is for me and that nothing else can come against me. And so that was the beginning of me really starting to say, okay, it feels almost painful for you to see me, God, but I'm going to start peeling back those layers and letting you in a little bit.
Wow. Yeah. That's really so hard for us to do as well. It's scary. It is a scary place. And yet, I think that's why it's so powerful for us to share our stories like you just did there, because we can tell other women, like, I know this is scary. I know it is literally pinpointing all of the places where your heart gets triggered. But I am telling you, I have walked there with the Lord, and he
Yeah.
is so good, and he is not going to abandon us, and he's not going to abandon you.
Which of the nameless women that you talked about in the book, which one do you think you can most identify with in your season right now?
That's such a great question. Someone else asked me that not long ago, and I have found like literally it's changing like within the last couple of months. There's a woman that I talk about, and I just call her the woman who worships. She's usually known in scripture as the sinful woman who comes and anoints Jesus's feet with her precious oil, and also washes them with her tears and her hair. For years, I thought her story was a story of, her tears kind of represented her shame. Like she was so ashamed of everything that was happening. But the more I studied it, I really began to see that Jesus had already forgiven her. Like she was showing up that day to like just give him her praise and her thanks. And I also believe like when we really receive the forgiveness of Jesus, like shame isn't there. Like
Yeah.
it's freed. And so as I started studying, I realized in her story, she gets upset her tears come about because Jesus is actually eating with a bunch of Pharisees, and he's basically snubbed. Like, they do not show him any of the proper hospitality greetings of that day and of that culture, which were so important. And she's sitting there watching the man who has absolutely changed her life and set her free, the man who she has already, she's ready to like give her most costly item to. And she realizes, like, no one around me is getting it. Like, they're not giving him the honor due his name. And so as she steps out, and basically what she does with her tears and her hair is she's basically giving him the hospitality and the specific rituals of that time that were missing to give him the honor due his name. And I felt like as I was studying her story, the Lord just started asking me questions about, like, um, am I with my life, am I honoring him and worshiping him with all that I am? And specifically, we live in a season right now where Jesus is often snubbed, so to speak. Like, does that hurt my heart?
Mhm.
Does my heart love him to the place that I just want to give him everything that I have? Or am I satisfied with where we're at, so to speak? So I think that's the one that's speaking to me right now. It's just those questions of, like, I don't want to ever get comfortable. I don't want to ever just kind of give him, my crumbs, so to speak, the things that I think, yeah, this is what's standard or normal. Like, no, I really want to be over the top a little bit too much in my love and worship for him.
I love that. It's over the
Yeah.
top, a little too much. That's a good
Yeah.
way of thinking about it. Yeah, that's good. In the book you wrote, we are known only as we know him. Tell us more about what you mean about that.
Yeah. So what I began to see as I study these women is, it doesn't specifically say that they're looking for their identity, so to speak, but they were all going to him for some reason, for some need, or he was going to them. And what I saw was, yes, in these stories, we see something about these women and we discover something about who they are. But more than that, we discover something about who Jesus is. Like, in each one of those stories, the character is on full display. Like, his heart for people is on full display. And what I realized is that there have been seasons in my life where I'm really searching for aspects of who I am or my purpose. I mean, our whole world is, right? Like, that's why the self-help industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And yet, anytime, and I've read several self-help books. I'm not opposed to them. But when I do, I'm still left wanting a little bit. But what I started discovering is if I spend less time trying to know me and trying to discover who I am, and I start spending more time trying to get to know him, all of a sudden, because this is how the kingdom of God works, I get more clear on who I am. So, for instance, there was a season where I feel like the Lord invited me to know him more as my father. And I just really dove into, God, I want to know you as my dad. And I didn't even know it was going to happen. But as I didn't focus on myself, but I focused on who he was, I grew in my confidence that I'm his child, because the fact that he was my father then spoke identity to who I was. And he's our creator. And so that's so true. So if we were to go on, this journey of what does it mean that God's my shepherd? And not just like a little bit, but like really like dove into scripture. What does that mean? All of a sudden it would inform us more about who we are. Who is God, as my provider? All of a sudden it changes something about who we are and our ability to actually trust him. So my thought was, what if we stop spending so much time focused on trying to figure out who we are and we spend our time more focused on who he is?
I love that because, it tells us we're made in his image. And so if we don't figure out who he is, we have no hope of figuring out who he is trying to communicate that we are.
Yeah.
And the world is really loud about trying to tell us who we are or who we should be, or who is acceptable to be. And God, I think, is the opposite. He's pretty quiet about it. And it requires us intentionally getting quiet enough to listen.
Yes, you're so right. You're so right.
Yeah. And I love that you talk about legacy in the book. You share that women can leave a legacy even if it's hidden. Tell us about how that works, how women can utilize their influence but still remain Christ-centered.
Yeah. I love that word legacy. I know you do too. And I think too often, I kind of mentioned this earlier, whether we realize it or not, we start to define what legacy means.
Mhm.
I actually, the other day, I actually even just looked up the actual definition of legacy, and it actually means to leave something behind that remains. But I
Mm,
think too often we've thought, well, that means then that I have to do something quote unquote great in the world that people are talking about. But man, we're leaving legacies with our children and with our communities and with our friends when we are focused on the Lord. I talk about specifically, the woman at the well. And to this day, centuries later, we are still telling her story. She's still known as probably the first missionary, in biblical times. And yet
mm,
we don't know her name. And I
yeah.
think if we can get secure enough that we worry less about people knowing our name and we care more about the fact that people know his name,
Mm,
then we will leave a legacy. You can be secure that your life will leave a legacy because you are pointing people to Jesus. And he is the one thing that always remains.
yeah. That's so good.
Mhm.
I love to think about legacy instead of like, I think people talk about legacy most often in like the tangible things that you're
Mhm.
passing down, like, if you're handing down money or possessions, heirlooms, things like that. But I'm like, it is whether or not I screamed at my children today, and it is whether or not I prayed with them over them at night. And like, those are the things that are building the legacy. And
Yes.
I hope, I came from a pretty dysfunctional, chaotic family, but I hope that I am causing such a ruckus with my life that they may not know my name 6 generations from now, but they'll have a vague idea that at some point this family shifted. And at some point,
Mm,
this family started living for the Lord. And we started loving each other and being loyal to each other. And this family is honest and this family is kind. And that's a kind of legacy that I hope I'm leaving, regardless if we could leave money or not for the kids.
exactly. You're so right. Those are the things that remain. You just saying that. I just want to, my mom, she also grew up in a very dysfunctional home. Her father died when she was really young, and she and her mom, they all ended up coming to know the Lord, but not until much later in life. And to this day, she talks about an aunt, the first person in their family who came to know Jesus. And she said, I will never forget as a kid going to her house and finding my name written on this. She had this like little prayer scroll and she had all their names. And she said, that stuck with me. Like, she's praying for me. And she said, when you grow up in a family where no one prays for you, when you first start realizing, oh, someone is praying for me, it lasts. And like to this day, that aunt has gone on to be with the Lord, but she literally changed the whole direction of that entire family now is saved. And my generation, like, I would say probably 60% of us are in some form of ministry. Like,
Wow.
how powerful that one woman's decision just absolutely trickled down to an entire family. So that, yeah,
So
we can,
incredible.
isn't that amazing? We can
Yeah.
do that. Yes.
Yeah. I used to get caught up too in the mistakes I was making and think that those kind of nullified and voided all any good that I was doing. Like, see, my kids are still going to have pain. Things are still messed up, and they're still going to end up on the therapist couch like I am. But I eventually the Lord was just like, yeah, every story is going to have some pain, but this is going to be a story that ends very differently than it started.
Yes.
And we don't have to get caught up in it's not perfect, but it's just the small things he can do really big things with.
Yes. That's so good.
Yeah. Okay. I love to ask people this question. If you can tell us about something that you're currently finding freedom from by finishing the sentence up until now.
Okay. You gave me a heads up on this one. So I had to think about it for a minute, but this is so true. Up until now, I thought it mattered to have the last word.
That's
Oh,
good. Tell us more.
yeah. Well, mostly has to do with my husband, husband and I. But also just kind of this thought of up until now, I felt like it mattered to be right. And the Lord has really been challenging me. Does it matter, especially relationally, for you to be right or for you to understand? And so I've been trying
Mm.
to make that transition. A lot of times, especially in my communication with my husband or my children, the people I'm closest to, so often I would go to that relationship with a desire to make my point known or to explain why my reasoning was right. And that doesn't usually go well. Let's just be
You
honest.
don't say.
And so just shifting the thought of, I actually don't have to be right, but instead, I want the goal to understand. I want them to understand what I'm trying to communicate, but I also need to try to understand where they're coming from.
Mm.
Because a lot of things that I think for years I thought were a right or wrong issue are actually just different angles that we might be looking at the same situation. So
Yes,
I'm working on that.
that is really good. Do you feel like that's trickling down to your kids at all?
I think it is actually,
Yeah.
I think there's something really powerful when kids hear their parents ask for forgiveness, or when kids, and I've been trying to do that more often, of like, hey, I'm really sorry. Yesterday, when I gave this ultimatum, so to speak,
Yeah.
I felt strongly about what I felt, but I'm sorry I didn't give you more chance to really explain your side of things.
Yeah.
And I want to hear that now. And what I'm seeing, I have two girls. I'm seeing them, not all the time, but I'm seeing them occasionally listen to one another a little bit better. And so maybe
That's
that's
a
a
huge
legacy.
win.
Yeah, right? That
Yeah.
I'm trying to hand down.
Yeah. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Where can people listen to your podcast and find you and find your book?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you. So I have a website you can go to. It's Paige Allen. I do have a podcast. It's called Bloom Talks. And it's a little bit different than most podcasts because I do work at a local church. I invite primarily just women right here from our church to come on because my heart is, I believe every woman has a story and every woman has something that God has deposited in her that she needs to impart to others. And so a lot of the women on my podcast, you're not going to know them anywhere else, but these are women who have just really lived amazing lives with God. And so my
I love
podcast is
that.
called Bloom Talks. It's everywhere podcasts are out. We've been going for about 4 years, and it's a really fun one. And then my book is called He Knows Your Name. And it's available everywhere books are sold. Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Baker Bookhouse are the places to get it. And then, social media, Paige Allen, and then the whole word Texas. I'm a proud Texan, so that's
I
where you can
love
find
it.
me. Yeah.
Yes. You guys, I really recommend her book. It's an easy read, but also really convicting, and you will not be sorry that you picked it up. So He Knows Your Name. And thank you, Paige, so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I loved it.